Welcome back to Sunrise Daily. Well, yes, taking a look at, well, not just education today, but the goings-on in society. We've got Professor Gordon Sogolo. He's an emeritus professor of philosophy at the National Open University, Abuja. He joins us from our studios in Abuja. Good morning, Prof, and good to see you again today. And at least thanks for obliging us, dragging you out on this holiday. But, you know, in your piece, Morality and the State, quite an interesting read. But looking at some parts of that, and you went down memory lane, you spoke about why you're accepted to deliver that lecture. You spoke about lecturers having to also lead the walls, but give us a background, for instance, when the reason why you chose that particular theme, linking it with goings on in society today.
Thank you, Chamberlain. Thank you for having me. The theme for the convocation of this year, the theme chosen by the Nigeria Academy of Letters was religion and morality in a secular state. And I was asked to take a topic out of that, and I did, and I picked morality and the state, the Nigeria experience. And now this choice, the choice of this topic was prompted by my observations and you know, what I experienced, which I had already, you know, written in my book, Anthology, Nigeria Yesterday, Today, which was published in 2012. And I noticed there and observed there that the challenges that faced Nigeria in, you know, colonial times and immediately after colonialism were still existing in our societies today. And, you know, some of these were the issues that I raised. First, the issue of morality, that we had challenges in immediately after colonialism. We had challenges of morality. And what were the challenges? I refer to the research done by one Professor Peter Ike, a renowned sociologist at Ibadan. And his observations were that colonialism, you know, restructured the Nigerian social system, so much so that the kinship system, small units of kinship system that existed at the time, were transformed into larger ethnic groups, you know, made up of larger groups like the Yoruba, the Hausa, the Igbo, and so forth, which now had political interests. And because they had political interests, there were, you know, effects, consequences on the moral behavior, the moral conduct of Nigerians. And Eke said that, you see, that the Nigerian moral system was structured into two components, what he called the primordial moral realm and then the civic moral realm. In the primordial moral realm, there, you know, where morality, you know, was adhered to, moral sentiment existed. But when it transformed into the civic moral realm, take, for instance, in the office, public relations and so forth with government, it became a totally different thing. So while people felt okay, obeying, you know, rules, moral rules, behavior was all right at the primordial level, at the village level, at the office, it was totally a different thing. It was amoral. In other words, people did not feel any loyalty to the larger system. And so what they did was that there was a divided society where moral rules applied, moral rules that applied to the primordial realm did not apply to the civic realm. And then, of course, being in philosophy, I had studied the very concept of morality, and I tried, what is morality? See, morality is a system that makes it possible for society to survive. And, you know, where there are no rules, where people do not obey certain rules in society, of course, society will collapse. And it was the philosopher Thomas Hobbes who said that without a government, without moral rules, without principles that people obey, life will be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And my fear is that we are tending towards that because apart from the situation that was observed by Professor Ike, it has gone worse today. The divide which Ike observed between the primordial and the civic is still even better than what we have today, where you have the tendency towards moral apathy, where the youth, for instance, even those, some of them educated, do not have that moral upbringing.
Prof,
that's a problem there.
Okay, let me jump in there and then ask you, because, you know, in several societies, many will look to the ivory tower for some beacon of hope or light, in a manner of speaking. But you also spoke about your time at University of Ibadan, then afterwards, you know, with the realities of life. And then you mentioned that your colleagues hiding behind the ivory tower, entertaining what you describe as unrealistic situations about man. Could you tell us about that? And then you enjoin them to actually go other. What was your point there?
Now, you see, I remember my days at the university. I remembered, for instance, when I graduated from the University of Ife in 1972, I had the offer of 3 jobs, out of which I needed to choose. And when I started my job at the University of Ibadan in 1976, I was instantly given a car loan. I was given a hotel accommodation with free meals. Now, Nigeria was that good at that time. Now, consider the plight of our fresh graduates today. It is terrible. And that is the kind of thing I was thinking about. And I need to say, beginning to have a nostalgic feelings of the days, the glorious days that we have left behind. And what I believe is that today's education is not doing the kind of thing that we had in the time past. Today, students are, taught the techniques, skills, vocational techniques, and so forth. But these are bereft of moral, attitude. Some of them do not today have that moral training. And the importance of this moral training is that it is what really transforms you. We, according to Aristotle, are animals at the beginning, and we are really what he calls tabula rasa. When you are born into society, right, you do not have anything. And then, of course, the imprint will come in, the intellectual imprint. Then
pardon me, Professor. I mean, we're going to be jumping in so we can go back and forth on this. But at this point then, are you saying that, or is your point that the ivory tower has failed society, or society has failed the ivory tower? Who has failed who?
No, what I'm saying is that we need an orientation in education. The education that merely imparts skills and techniques into students, and then they graduate with these techniques. It's not sufficient. This is what I'm saying. I'm not saying that the ivory tower has failed. I'm saying that there needs to be an orientation in our educational system, such as the goals of our education will also include the making of the human person. You see, today, the rush is for, courses that have technical skills, technology, medicine, law, journalism, including your own field. Okay, they are right. But there are disciplines like philosophy, moral education, that will begin to, train the human mind, begin to inculcate in the youth moral conduct. This is what I'm saying. So the tertiary education is all right, but there needs to be reorientation. How many students study philosophy in this country? The University of Ibadan, which is the premier university, was established in 1948 and did not start the teaching of philosophy until 1973. All right? Until recently, when Ahmadu Bello started teaching philosophy, there was no university in that part of this country had a philosophy department. So this is the kind of thing I'm trying to say. think about those disciplines that humanize, those disciplines that teach the individual the art of being human. It is important because no matter what skills you have, until you really begin to behave like a human person, of course you are not yet a human person, and society cannot survive without that aspect of education. This is the point I was making.
Professor Sogolo, I'd just like to jump in here. Now, you've mentioned that, I mean, young people perhaps need to look at philosophy as a course to study in the university, but you'll hear some young people saying that, how much can you make of philosophy? For example, I'm just saying, say they want to be DJs or musicians. I mean, the list goes on and on. Now, that's on one side. I mean, how viable are these options? And also, in that write-up, you said, I mean, there needs to be a reorientation of the youth if we are to save this nation. That was what you said. But then some young people will also say that, I mean, during your time, for example, you got a car loan, you got allowances, things were rosy. In fact, you had, I think, about 3 options to choose from, or 2 options. But they will say that, I mean, your generation perhaps are responsible for what we have now. So what do you say to that? Young people that are saying, don't put the blame on us, put the blame on your generation.
Well, I'm putting the blame on, I'm really putting the blame on the educational system. I'm saying that there needs to be a reorientation in the educational system, the retooling of our educational system. In other words, we need to make sure that apart from inculcating, skills, techniques, and so forth into our students, we must also reorientate their mind. You see, today, our children are growing up, almost like machines. They do not behave like human beings. And it is important that you take this aspect very seriously. The training, the education that they need is totally different from just impacting techniques into them. You might say that it's a failing of our own generation, but I'm saying that the educational system itself is misdirected. And of course, apart from that, there's been failure in governance over the years. When a government fails to take care of the individual, of course, the individual also responds by being disloyal, responds by not abiding by moral rules. This is the point. So it is the failure, it is a question of, what the government has failed. And I'm strictly talking here, that's my own area of expertise. I'm talking about the educational system, that the educational system needs to be reorientated so that our students are taught these qualities, the human qualities.
You just mentioned something now, Prof, and that's you said governance has failed. And in your paper, you cited the failure of governance and ineffective planning in education as the major causes of damage to the Nigerian moral system. Failure of governance is something even, politicians in America also have adduced to, they qualify it in different ways. In our own context, when you say failure of governance here as a contributory factor to the damage of the Nigerian moral system, what are you talking about?
Now, what I'm talking about is that when I talk about the failure of governance, is that the failure of the educational system, the reorientation. What do you teach your students? This is the point. We have a duty to teach our students. Let me explain this. You see, the great Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and so forth, emphasize the role of education in the upbringing of the human person. And that at the beginning, because the human mind is blank, what you need is to begin to educate them. Without education, the human being is never morally fulfilled. You cannot be a complete human person unless you are fully educated. And what that means is not just impacting techniques into people. It means you must teach people what values are. These values must then be internalized so that they live the values. This is not happening. This is my point. We are not living our values. Most value, even when taught these values, most of our children are not growing up with these values, including our adults. Let me not limit this to children. Let me tell you, in the past, when our children, indulge in examination malpractices, we chastise them. We blame them. Today, teachers, parents are themselves, plotting examination malpractices for children. That is wrong, both for the children as well as for the adults. And
at what point did we lose that? Because just as you said, that is what existed before now. At what point did we derail, so to speak?
Did we do what?
Point did we derail from this moral education or moral way of doing things?
You see, we derailed when we started emphasizing the paper qualification. People wanted to have techniques. You wanted to do medicine, you wanted to do engineering, you wanted to do law, and so forth, because these are the disciplines that will bring you jobs. Doing philosophy does not link you to any particular job. As I observed in my paper, I said most of my colleagues who went into philosophy in those days did not do philosophy out of choice, but as a last resort. Last resort in the sense that they did not see where to go, and then they took on to philosophy. Yet philosophy is that discipline that will teach you, will humanize you, the discipline that will teach you the act of thinking, the discipline that will, bring you, make you a human person. It is only today that many, some Nigerians are beginning to, see that value in philosophy. Philosophy and another discipline. Let me not just say it is only philosophy. And that aspect of philosophy that does is moral education. We need it in this country.
In your paper as well, Prof, you referenced colonialism as as causing disruption in our moral, way of doing things. But we've done that. We've been in this independence now for about almost 60 years. Shouldn't we have found a way around it now?
No, see, we make the error of thinking that certain problems, dysfunctions can be corrected overnight. No, it is not like that. You see, what colonialism did was almost a permanent damage, which exists in the moral system, in the moral fabric, and it still exists today. You see, when your kinsman, just because it's your kinsman, you begin to defend yes, when you begin to defend your kinsman and say because it's just your kinsman, when he's found guilty of infractions.
All right, Prof, let me attempt to jump in and see if you could hear me. But, many listening at the moment will just feel, father is a younger lad who will think, look, well, yes, those days you've given us a very rosy picture. If some people could turn back the hands of time, they would do it. But in spite of all that your generation went through, we expected that they would have led this country perhaps to a very good place. But, they still see some things going on. They see cases of persons who are reported to have looted the country, who have misled, misgoverned, in spite of all those philosophical education, good education that they had, values, the morals that existed at the time. And then people look to them for examples, but they don't see all of those things. So how do people who are coming forth, looking at the examples, the bad ones that they're setting, that's going to eventually, of course, impact negatively. How do we then connect the dots? How do you validate your message in light of that example?
You see, again, you're going back to the same point I made earlier, that the colonial experience had this damage done to our moral system. And the damage still persists today. And I've given several instances. You have our politicians who loot, who plunder. But what happens? They are defended by their ethnic men. And I quoted the renowned legal luminary, Femi Falana, my friend. And I quoted him, he said, Nigeria is the only place where somebody who has been found guilty is celebrated. And it's ethnic, it's group, people from his ethnic group now, wear Ashroibi and hit beat drums and celebrate him. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about. So if there were some uniform morality, then it would be a different thing. And I'm saying that AK was right in saying that that damage was done from colonial times. It is not something that you can willfully say, okay, we have solved it. You have not resolved that problem. It is still there. You defend people from your place rather than keep to moral principles. This is what you and I do. And
yeah, we can hear you, but Prof, is that prevalent or they are isolated cases? That is not what's prevalent at the moment, is it?
Oh, it is. It is. It is very much widespread. Only recently, I talked about a letter that was written by the Council of Chiefs of one of these former ministers who has been accused of infractions, corruption, and the Council of Chiefs from our place wrote to President Muhammadu Buhari saying that their daughter had not done anything wrong and that they should be left alone. Now, these are chiefs, all right, who are supposed to be the custodian of values in their respective domain. They are the ones writing this. What is happening? And you say that's not prevalent? It is prevalent. It is, you find it in all our communities. Once the morality moves to the larger society, they begin to defend their own people. And that, I say, is misorientation. That, I say, is miseducation. And we need to retool that. We need to correct that fault in our children. We can no longer correct it in ourselves, but with our children, we should be able to retool the educational system such that they will grow up and begin to find that there's no distinction between somebody from their own place and somebody from elsewhere. If any of them is guilty of an infraction, it should be so judged. This is the point I'm trying to make. But today, it is prevalent.
We'll go to break. We'll come back and talk about what's the way out, because you also spoke about some of those. So join us again. Welcome back. We'll still have Emeritus Professor with us here in the studios, Godwin Sogolo from our studios in Abuja. Well, could you speak to us about solutions now? When you look at the piece, when you spoke about failure of morality, you also highlighted failure in governance and loss of faith in the state. What can be the way out? How do we correct that?
Yeah, first of all, if we're looking for a solution, we must also turn to government. Government must fulfill its obligation, contractual obligation to the citizens. When government fails the citizens, of course, the citizens will have no reason to, respond positively. So many people are turning their back on government. They don't feel any obligation to behave well, any obligation to be loyal to the government, and so forth, because government has failed in its obligation to them. If you observe this, most citizens take care of themselves, either of their infrastructure, their communities take care of them, and so forth. And so government has abandoned a lot of people. I mentioned in my presentation, I mentioned the educational system that was, on and on, turning its back from the people. And I said, when people begin to take care of themselves, then of course they see no reason to be loyal to government. And the major failure, and that is where you really start looking for a solution, is in the educational system. You must try to reorientate the educational system such that you will emphasize the training of the human mind, the imparting of values into our youth, so that young people will now begin to make a distinction between good and evil. They must inculcate that into them. They must internalize that so that their behavior will reflect that, because without that, of course, the collapse will continue, the moral collapse will continue. This is the point. And I'm suggesting that to do that, you must emphasize certain disciplines, one of which is philosophy. because philosophy not only imparts into the individual values, good orientation, positive orientation, it also teaches them how to relate individually with one another. That is what philosophy does. So until that teaching, that begins to go across many of our institutions, then of course you find that the problem will continue. When you award your degrees at the end of a student period, what do you say? You say, we find you worthy in learning and character. In learning, yes, but in character, what have you done to check the character of this student? What did you do to ensure that these are positive, well-behaved graduates you are turning out? Nothing. You just make that pronouncement in learning and character. That aspect of character is never emphasized in any of our institutions. This is the point I'm saying. You must now retool the system. You must now turn back and reorientate the educational system so as to emphasize this aspect of value, this moral aspect. We need it in our society.
Prof, you talked about the character bit now, and it's quite instructive. And in order to be able to get there, we have to understand where we are at this moment. We're in a democracy, and democracy runs, through politics. You also mentioned, of course, that morality is indispensable, and in every facet of our life, especially, you mentioned a few, one of which is politics. Now, in this politics, you said is the dominant and orthodox view is that the politician must be of noble and sincere character. The exception is Niccolò Machiavelli, who, of course, we all know is one that doesn't believe in morality. He just believes that the end justifies the means, using manipulative skills, ingenuity, and all of that. It would seem then that the exception is the rule now. How do we reverse to what you consider as the orthodox and dominant view?
Yes, first of all, generally, you observe something about morality. When I said morality is pervasive, so all-embracing, it means almost in every aspect of our human life, there is morality. In religion, in politics, and of course in law. Now, the political aspect of our morality is that politicians, even politicians, almost every human being will want to be considered to be a good person. We all want to be regarded as good, morally good persons. What we do in life, most of the time, you observe that we praise one another, we blame one another, and then we pass judgment on one another. And so these are things that are common to all human beings. But when politicians find that they can manipulate successfully, right, they do so. Almost every human being, we find that without that morality within you, and you have an opportunity of manipulating others, they try to do so. So our politicians must be morally educated. This is what Plato has said when he talked about, in the Republic, when he talked about moral education, that you must educate, otherwise you will not live a fulfilled life. Every human being must be morally educated. Unless, without that, he will not live a fulfilled life. Now, that is my point. When you're looking for a solution, you must go back to Plato on moral education.
All right. Professor Sogolo, as it seems now, you have sold philosophy to a lot of us. I mean, you have done that consistently, which is interesting. I'm sure a lot of people are looking to, study philosophy rather. But let's take a look at some solutions that you have brought up. Now, you seem to have a lot of ideas. I mean, I was going through your paper and I saw a lot of things that caught my attention. We've talked about some of those things today, but then you have a lot to offer as it stands. And then there's the young crop of people in Nigeria that are wondering, where do we go from here? How do we, step into leadership roles, for example? How do we make a change? How do we get to start giving ourselves reorientation? I mean, the list goes on and on. So how do we bridge this gap? A lot of young people believe the older generation speaks down at them, or they just offer them, things to just grapple with. So how do we bridge this gap such that this generation would learn from your generation and then the chain continues?
Yeah, the You see, let me just say this clearly. The problem with many of our youths is that they are not morally educated. They are ignorant. And it's clear from, the traditional philosophical viewpoint that you cannot do evil, all right, knowingly. You cannot do evil knowingly. In other words, if you know what is bad, you will not do it. And most people commit evil because they do not know what is bad. And that is the essence of it. Most of our young children are educated only in the technical sense. They're not morally educated. They have not been able to imbibe those values that make you a human person. That is the aspect. Most Nigerians do not, well, not only Nigerians, a lot of other people do not realize that you must cultivate the human mind. You must cultivate the values in us. You must internalize them. Then you become a human person. How many people can do that? You see, we are carried off most of the time by material needs. We're carried off by the harsh realities of life and so forth. But the real person is made when he is morally educated. Our children, some of them begin to feel that morality is old-fashioned. To say morality is old-fashioned is to say the human being is old-fashioned. But we cannot say that. That's an aberration. We are never old-fashioned. The human being, morality itself is immutable. In other words, it doesn't change much. We as human beings change. Society changes. But the moral values, the human being, you and I do not change. The human person, the values that existed hundreds of years ago are still the values that we live by. Because without them, according to Thomas Hobbes, life will be solitary, all right, nasty, poor, brutish, and short. That is the life without morality.
Just to speak for some young people, perhaps this morning, they would say, we're not in government, for example. Young people are not at the helms of affairs of this country. I'm sure you recognize that. So they begin to wonder, how are we the problem here? Yes, how don't we contribute to making this country better? So if you say that young people, for example, are immoral, they would also say that look to people in government. So the question is, we need to start bridging this gap. The young people feel they're not the problem. There are people there that feel, you know what, the young people are the problem. So we'll keep having this back and forth. And obviously, this might end up being a brutish, I mean, as you painted, a brutish scenario for everybody. So how do we bridge this gap moving forward?
Yeah, I think you misunderstand me. I'm not blaming the young people. I'm talking about the failure in the educational system, the failure in us, the failure to bring up, to implement an educational system that imparts these values in our young people. That our young people are lacking in this does not mean that they are culpable. They are not to blame for that. It is the education that was given to them, all right? But they have the problem. That's what I'm saying. They have the problem. But the problem is brought on them by the failure of governance, by the failure of the educational system. This is my point. I'm not really saying the young people are to blame. Of course, the young people have their lives. When a young man believes that it is all right to cheat, when a young man believes that it's all right to commit exam malpractices, when he believes that you can, extort money, you can kidnap and make money, of course he's culpable. You have to blame him. He's a human person, but the society that has failed to bring him up as a morally good person is the society that you blame. So I say the fault is with the system, but the consequences are on our children. This is what I'm trying to say. These are facts that are so obvious. And we tend to hide from them by saying, oh, who do we blame? It's not a game of blaming this or blaming that. We must look back at the educational system and say we need to correct what is happening. We must look back at governance and say government is not doing what it ought to do to its citizens. These are the areas we have to look into. But my area primarily is education. And moral education is my special concern, that our people, Nigerians, particularly of this generation, are not morally educated. And I believe that you cannot do something that is good unless you are morally educated. This is my point.
All right, where we're going to leave it this morning. Gordon Sogolo is an emeritus professor of philosophy. Perhaps those who are making up their minds or trying to make up their minds on what profession to do, they can also take a look at that. Always a pleasure to have you on, and thank you for coming.